Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The Second Congo War has been called Africa's Great War. According to Reuters, it is the deadliest conflict since the Second World War, though the true death toll remains elusive, hidden beneath decades of silence and uncertainty. Some researchers estimate 3 million dead. Others push the number closer to 5. Still others argue that the chaos and displacement it unleashed created a humanitarian disaster that defies counting. What is certain is that millions perished, not always from bullets or bombs, but from hunger, disease, and the slow violence of being uprooted from their homes. And yet, for all its enormity, the war is barely remembered outside the African continent. While Europe endlessly revisits its 20th century tragedies, World War I's trenches, World War II's genocides, and the Cold War's nuclear brinkmanship, the Congo's war remains largely absent from classrooms, newsrooms, and public memory in the West. Why? Partly because the war itself refuses easy explanation. It was fought by shifting coalitions of nations and militias, its front lines dissolving and reforming like mist. Alliances reversed. Enemies became allies overnight, then turned against each other again. Few battles resembled the clean, decisive set pieces of European wars. Instead, it was a war of raids, ambushes, splintering factions, and proxy armies. A war that swallowed civilians, villages, even entire provinces into its furnace. Defining when it began and when it ended is equally difficult. Some historians argue that the Second Congo War is just the continuation of the first, a conflict that began in 1996 when Mobutu Sese Seko's dictatorship collapsed. Others point to 1998, when Laurent-Désiré Kabila, the man who replaced Mobutu, turned against the very foreign allies who had helped him seize power. Still others insist the war never really ended at all, that it simply morphed into a lingering, smoldering series of conflicts that Congo still suffers today. For the Congolese people, however, there was no ambiguity. From Kinshasa to Kisangani, from the jungles of Ituri to the diamond mines of Katanga, war meant death, hunger, and the grinding terror of uncertainty. Families were driven into refugee camps, children were pressed into armies, farmers abandoned fields to overgrowth. Roads once alive with trade turned into corridors of fear. This was a war not just of armies, but of entire societies unraveling. To understand how such a catastrophe unfolded, we must first peel back the layers of history that led to it. The scars of colonial borders, the hatreds deepened by genocide, and the ambitions of leaders who saw in Congo not a nation, but a prize. Only then can we grasp why this conflict, though overshadowed in global memory, deserves its title as Africa's Great War. To understand the Second Congo War, one must first return to a time when the map of Africa was drawn not by Africans, but by Europeans. In 1884, at the Berlin Conference, diplomats in fine suits carved the continent into colonies, slicing across rivers, mountains, and ancestral homelands. These men, many of whom had never set foot in Africa, placed rulers and compasses over maps, dividing territory with straight lines and careless curves. They were not thinking of clans, languages, or cultures. They were thinking of resources: copper, ivory, rubber, gold. The result was a patchwork of states where communities that had lived separately for centuries were forced under the same flag, while others were split apart, scattered across hostile borders. Nowhere was this fracture more visible than in Central Africa. The Belgian Congo became the personal possession of King Leopold II, who treated it not as a colony, but as a private estate to be plundered. Under his rule, rubber quotas were enforced with whips, mutilations, and death. Millions perished, leaving wounds that scarred Congolese memory long after Leopold was gone. Even when the Congo passed from his personal empire to the Belgian state, its rulers left behind a system that was not built to nurture citizens, but to extract wealth. Schools and hospitals were scarce. Roads led not to villages, but to mines. A country was created, but a nation was not. And beyond Congo, the same colonial logic festered in neighboring Rwanda and Burundi. Here, the Belgian authorities institutionalized divisions between two groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. In truth, these were not rigid tribes in the modern sense. They were fluid social categories shaped by centuries of migration and intermarriage. But colonial officials, eager to simplify rule, hardened them into racial identities. They declared Tutsis taller, more noble, closer to Europeans in bearing. Hutus, they said, were peasants. Identity cards were issued labeling each person as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. From that moment, what had once been flexible boundaries of class became lines of enmity, reinforced by bureaucracy and discrimination. These artificial hierarchies fueled resentment. Tutsis, backed by Belgian administrators, often held political and economic power, while the far more numerous Hutus simmered with anger. What began as a tool of colonial control would over decades evolve into open hostility, culminating in genocides, coups, and the mass flight of refugees across the Great Lakes region. For Congo, this mattered deeply. Its eastern provinces bordered Rwanda and Burundi, becoming a refuge for waves of displaced people. Each influx carried not only the trauma of exile, but also the seeds of conflict. Ethnic wars spilled across borders like floods breaching a levee. The Congolese state, already fragile, would be forced to bear the weight of hatreds that had been sharpened by colonial rulers decades earlier. This is the inheritance with which Congo entered the late 20th century, a country stitched together by outsiders, fragile under the weight of its own geography, and vulnerable to the ethnic and political storms brewing just beyond its frontiers. The storm that would eventually ignite the Congo Wars truly began in 1994 in the hills of Rwanda. That year, the world watched, or rather failed to watch, as one of the fastest and most horrifying genocides in modern history unfolded. In the span of just 100 days, extremist leaders of the Hutu majority orchestrated a campaign of slaughter against their Tutsi neighbors. The tools were primitive: machetes, clubs, cheap rifles. But the killing was systematic. Roadblocks were set up where identity cards determined life or death. Radio stations, instead of music, broadcast calls to hunt down cockroaches, the dehumanizing slur used for Tutsis. By July, nearly 800,000 people, men, women, children, were dead. Bodies filled churches, rivers, roadsides. Some of the few who survived recall the silence of the international community as louder than the gunshots. UN peacekeepers stood by with orders not to intervene. Western governments debated terminology. Was it really genocide or just acts of genocide? But for Rwanda, there was no debate. A society had been torn apart. When the killing finally ended, it was not because the world stepped in. It was because the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a Tutsi-led rebel force commanded by Paul Kagame, seized control of the country. Rwanda's Hutu government collapsed, and in its wake, nearly 2 million Hutus fled across the border into neighboring countries, terrified of reprisal. Many were innocent civilians, but among them were genocidaires, Hutu extremists, militias, and former government soldiers who carried their weapons and their hatred with them into exile. The Democratic Republic of Congo, then still known as Zaire, absorbed the greatest share of this exodus. In the forests and fields of eastern Congo, vast refugee camps sprang up almost overnight. To outside observers, they looked like humanitarian safe havens. In reality, many became militarized bases where Hutu militias regrouped, rearmed, and launched raids back into Rwanda. This was the birth of what came to be known as the Tutsi diaspora in the region. Thousands of Congolese Tutsis, known locally as Banyamulenge, found themselves trapped between hostile Congolese factions and resentful refugees, while exiled Rwandan Tutsis demanded protection from across the border. The genocide had not stayed contained within Rwanda's borders. It spilled outward like fire through dry grass, igniting tensions across the Great Lakes region. Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and especially Congo would all feel its heat. Eastern Congo, with its weak government presence and porous frontiers, became the battleground where unfinished business from Rwanda would be fought out. It is here, in the shadow of genocide, that the seeds of the Second Congo War were sown. By the mid-1990s, Zaire, soon to be renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, was a nation rotting from the inside out. Its ruler, Mobutu Sese Seko, had once been courted by Western governments as a Cold War ally. But after 3 decades of kleptocracy, The state he left behind was little more than a hollow shell. Roads crumbled, hospitals stood without medicine, and government officials went unpaid for months at a time. The name Zairian miracle that Mobutu once boasted of had long turned bitter. His trademark leopard skin hat became a symbol not of strength, but of vanity and decay. Into this vacuum of power stepped Laurent-Désiré Kabila, a longtime rebel who had once flirted with Marxism in the jungles of eastern Congo. For years, Kabila was little more than a minor warlord, commanding a small band of fighters. But history gave him an opportunity. After the 1994 Rwandan genocide, Rwanda's new Tutsi-led government sought to destroy the Hutu extremist militias that had entrenched themselves in eastern Zaire. Uganda, too, had its own enemies launching raids across the border. Both countries needed a Congolese ally to spearhead their campaign, and they found him in Kabila. With Rwandan and Ugandan backing, Kabila's Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, began its march westward in late 1996. Their campaign was swift, brutal, and effective. Rwandan officers, veterans of the genocide's aftermath, supplied discipline and firepower. Congolese Tutsis, with everything to lose, filled the ranks. Town after town fell, and with them Mobutu's crumbling facade of authority. As the rebels advanced, the scale of Mobutu's neglect became painfully clear. Soldiers abandoned their posts for lack of pay. Civilians, weary of decades of corruption, sometimes greeted the rebels as liberators. Yet liberation came with its own horrors. In the pursuit of Hutu militias hiding among refugees, the AFDL and their allies attacked camps, killing not only fighters, but countless civilians. These massacres foreshadowed the violence and impunity that would define the wars to come. By May 1997, the march was complete. Mobutu fled into exile, dying soon after in Morocco, and Kabila entered Kinshasa as president of the new Democratic Republic of Congo. In the capital, crowds cheered his arrival, hoping for an end to decades of stagnation. To many Congolese, Kabila represented change, a chance at reclaiming dignity from the ruins of Mobutu's empire. But hope is fragile, and in Congo, it rarely lasted long. Laurent-Désiré Kabila arrived in Kinshasa in 1997 not as a seasoned statesman, but as a revolutionary who suddenly found himself seated at the head of a shattered nation. His rise had been swift, and so too were the expectations placed upon him. The people of Congo, exhausted by Mobutu's decades of corruption, imagined that change had finally come. They pictured roads rebuilt, wages restored, and schools once again filled with children. But what they received instead was a man caught in the trap that ensnares so many new rulers. The very allies who had placed him in power now demanded their share of influence. Rwandan and Ugandan officers who had fought at Kabila's side remained deeply embedded in the new government and military. In Kinshasa, their presence was impossible to ignore. To ordinary Congolese citizens, it looked as if their nation had traded one master for another. Rumors spread that Kabila was merely a puppet, a figurehead masking foreign control. Each sight of Rwandan soldiers patrolling Congolese streets hardened resentment. National pride, once hopeful, turned suspicious. Kabila himself seemed acutely aware of this. A man of the bush rather than the palace, he dressed simply, speaking bluntly, often more like a guerrilla commander than a head of state. In his speeches, he railed against imperialism, promising independence and dignity. Yet his position was weaker than his words. The same foreign forces that had carried him to power now tied his hands. He could not easily expel them, nor could he easily control them. Every decision was haunted by the question, was he serving Congo or Rwanda and Uganda? Meanwhile, across the vastness of the country, chaos continued. Guerrilla groups that Rwanda and Uganda had hoped to crush were far from gone. Hutu extremists launched raids across Rwanda's border. In Uganda, the Allied Democratic Forces, a Sudanese-backed rebel group, slipped through forests, kidnapping villagers and striking military outposts. Congo became not a haven of peace, but a staging ground for conflict. To strengthen his hold, Kabila tried to distance himself from the Tutsi allies who had brought him to power. He sought to appeal instead to Congolese nationalism. casting himself as a true son of the soil who would no longer bend to outsiders. In doing so, he alienated the Banyamulenge, Congolese Tutsis who had fought and bled for his cause. Distrust spread on all sides. To the Congolese masses, Kabila's rhetoric was welcome. To his foreign patrons, it was betrayal. The fragile balance could not last. By trying to consolidate his own authority, Kabila had planted the seeds of his undoing. The uneasy alliance that had toppled Mobutu was beginning to fracture, and in the cracks, the shadow of a new war began to stir. By 1998, Laurent Kabila's experiment in balancing his foreign patrons with Congolese nationalism had unraveled. What began as whispers in Kinshasa that Rwanda and Uganda held too much sway in the corridors of power soon hardened into open hostility. For ordinary Congolese, the sight of foreign officers issuing orders in their army was a humiliation. For Kabila, it was a political death sentence. The final break came in July of that year. In a bold, almost theatrical move, Kabila dismissed James Kabarebe, the Rwandan chief of staff who had commanded his army. Kabarebe was no ordinary officer. He had been instrumental in bringing Kabila to power, coordinating the campaign that toppled Mobutu. Removing him was not just a personnel change. It was a declaration that Rwanda's time of influence in Kinshasa was over. Within days, Kabila went further. He ordered all Rwandan military personnel to leave Congo immediately. To some Congolese, it was an act of defiance, proof that their president was no puppet. Crowds cheered as rumors spread that foreign soldiers were packing their bags. Yet beneath the celebrations lay an ominous silence. For Kabila had not only expelled his former allies, he had humiliated them. And in politics, humiliation is a wound that festers into vengeance. Inside Rwanda and Uganda, the message was clear. They had invested blood, treasure, and political capital to create a friendly regime in Congo, only to be discarded when it no longer suited Kabila's ambitions. Worse still, Kabila had not curbed the guerrilla groups that continued to raid across their borders. Some reports even suggested that he tolerated or quietly encouraged these fighters, hoping to insulate himself from accusations of being too close to the Tutsis. His gamble was simple. By sacrificing his alliance with Rwanda, he might gain legitimacy among his own people. It worked, briefly. In Kinshasa, Kabila's reputation as a nationalist strengthened, but abroad, the knives were being sharpened. Rwanda and Uganda, once his indispensable allies, now viewed him as an obstacle to their security and influence. It was a classic tale of Congolese politics. Today's savior became tomorrow's betrayer. And the betrayals in Congo rarely ended with words. The stage was set for open rebellion. Within weeks of Kabarebe's dismissal, soldiers loyal to Rwanda and Uganda began planning their next move. In Goma, on Congo's eastern frontier, the embers of war began to glow once more. The final spark ignited on August 2, 1998. In the eastern city of Goma, the 10th Brigade of the Congolese Army, composed largely of Congolese Tutsis, the Banyamulenge, declared they would no longer serve under Kabila. Within hours, they announced the formation of a new rebel movement, the Rally for Congolese Democracy, or RCD. To the outside world, it looked like an internal mutiny. In reality, it was the opening act of a foreign-backed war. Rwanda and Uganda quickly seized upon the defection. To their governments, this was not betrayal, it was opportunity. Here was a ready-made justification for intervention. They were not invading, they insisted, but supporting Congolese rebels fighting against tyranny. It was a convenient fiction. In truth, both nations had long since decided Kabila was no longer useful, and the RCD provided a local mask for their ambitions. In Kinshasa, the announcement struck like thunder. Just 1 year earlier, Kabila had been hailed as the liberator who freed Congo from Mobutu's decaying dictatorship. Now, the very men who had delivered him to power were raising arms against him. For Congolese citizens, it was a dizzying reversal. The soldiers who once wore the mantle of liberators were recast as invaders, and the fragile hope that had bloomed in 1997 began to shrivel. Fear spread quickly. The memory of the First Congo War was still fresh, when a seemingly unstoppable column of rebels had marched across the country in months. If history repeated itself, Kinshasa could fall again before its people had even begun to recover. Rumors swirled of Rwandan and Ugandan troops massing on the borders, markets filled with panic buying, families whispered of fleeing westward, away from the front lines they knew would soon emerge. For the rebels in Goma, the uprising was more than politics. Many were Congolese Tutsis who felt increasingly unsafe under Kabila's government, which had begun to distance itself from them in its effort to shed the stigma of foreign control. Their defection was as much survival as it was strategy, but their choice carried with it the full weight of foreign backing, and once Rwanda and Uganda moved openly in their favor, what had started as a mutiny became a continental war. Thus began the Second Congo War, not with a formal declaration, but with betrayal, fear, and the steady drumbeat of boots marching once more into the heart of Africa. Just 2 days after the uprising in Goma, the conflict escalated with a move so audacious it seemed almost cinematic. On August 4, 1998, Rwandan and Ugandan forces launched what would be remembered as Operation Kitona. Using 4 civilian Boeing airliners commandeered from Goma's airport, they airlifted nearly 200 troops across the breadth of Congo, over 1,000 miles westward, straight to the Atlantic coast. Their destination, Kitona Air Base, only 250 miles from the capital, Kinshasa. The gamble worked. When the planes touched down, many of the Congolese troops stationed there defected on the spot, joining the invaders rather than fighting them. In a matter of hours, Kitona was in enemy hands. It became the staging ground for thousands more reinforcements flown in over the next days. The rebellion had leapt from the eastern frontier to the very doorstep of Congo's heart. From there, the assault gained terrifying momentum. Within a week, the rebels and their allies swept through Congo's central province, capturing the crucial port city of Matadi. For Kinshasa, this was a devastating blow. Matadi was the country's lifeline, its most important connection to the outside world. Control of the port meant control of food, fuel, and weapons flowing into the capital. The most chilling moment came when the invaders seized the Inga dams on August 13th. These massive hydroelectric stations powered Kinshasa itself. With the flick of a switch, the lights of the capital could go dark, plunging millions into panic. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though Kabila's government was living on borrowed time. In Kinshasa, fear turned to desperation. Markets shut down. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes. Government officials whispered of evacuation plans, preparing for the possibility that the capital might fall just as easily as it had under Mobutu. Laurent Kabila, the once confident revolutionary, now stood on the brink of losing everything, barely a year after seizing power. To the invaders, the campaign seemed destined for triumph. To observers, it was shockingly familiar. Just as in 1997, a swift advance across the vast country appeared unstoppable. But history this time would not repeat itself so neatly. Congo was no longer alone. When the rebels seized Kitona and Matadi, Kinshasa teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet in this moment of peril, Laurent Kabila discovered what Mobutu never had: powerful allies willing to fight for him. Within days of the invasion, foreign planes were landing in Congo, not with enemies aboard, but with reinforcements. The most decisive came from Angola and Zimbabwe. Angola's president, José Eduardo dos Santos, had his own reasons for intervening. For decades, his country had been plagued by UNITA, a rebel movement operating out of Angola's remote southeast. Dos Santos suspected, rightly, that Rwanda and Uganda were giving UNITA quiet support. If Congo fell under their control, UNITA's rear bases would only grow stronger. By aiding Kabila, Angola was protecting its own survival. Zimbabwe's motivations were more complex. President Robert Mugabe spoke of Pan-African solidarity, presenting his intervention as a defense of Congo's sovereignty against foreign aggression. But beneath the rhetoric lay financial calculations: lucrative mining contracts, joint ventures, and promises of access to Congo's vast resources. For Zimbabwe's struggling economy, Congo was both a battlefield and a business deal. Together, these allies shifted the balance. Angolan armored columns crossed into southwestern Congo, moving swiftly to block the rebel advance toward Kinshasa. Zimbabwean jets roared over the capital, their bombs halting the rebels in their tracks. For ordinary Congolese watching from the ground, the sight of foreign aircraft defending their city was surreal, a reminder that the war had outgrown Congo itself. Within weeks, the momentum had reversed. The lightning strike of Operation Kitona, which once seemed poised to deliver victory, was blunted by the sudden arrival of outside powers. By mid-August, the rebels were forced to retreat from the Western Front. The dream of seizing Kinshasa in a matter of days had collapsed into a grinding stalemate. Yet while Kinshasa was saved, Congo's nightmare was far from over. For in rushing to Kabila's aid, Zimbabwe and Angola had turned a civil war into something far larger, a continental struggle. Soldiers from across Africa now fought on Congolese soil. And like the great wars of Europe, each ally arrived not only with guns, but with ambitions of their own. By late 1998, the Second Congo War had transformed into something far greater than a rebellion or even a civil conflict. It was a continental conflagration, so sprawling and complex that observers began calling it Africa's World War. The comparison was not hyperbole. Much like the First World War, it was a labyrinth of alliances, betrayals, and overlapping interests, where a spark in one corner of the continent could send shockwaves across thousands of miles. On one side stood Laurent Kabila's government in Kinshasa, backed now by Angola, Zimbabwe, and later Namibia. For Angola, the fight was about crushing UNITA once and for all. For Zimbabwe, it was about mining contracts and influence. Namibia, bound by ties of solidarity with Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, sent troops to honor friendship as much as ideology. Each ally spoke of defending Congolese sovereignty, but each also had its own ledger of debts and rewards. On the other side stood Rwanda and Uganda, who had abandoned Kabila to build their own order in Congo. Backing them was the Rally for Congolese Democracy, RCD, which provided a Congolese facade for their intervention. Together, they sought to carve a friendly buffer zone in eastern Congo, eliminating cross-border raids and ensuring access to Congo's mineral wealth. Then came the wild cards. Sudan joined Kabila's camp, not out of love for Congo, but to harass Uganda, its longtime rival. Chad, meanwhile, was drawn in at France's behest, Paris eager to reassert its waning influence in Africa after its humiliation during the Rwandan Genocide. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi made appearances at the diplomatic table, offering himself as a peacemaker, though always with one eye on expanding Libyan clout in the region. To the Congolese people, these foreign armies were not saviors, but occupiers. Soldiers who spoke foreign tongues patrolled their villages. Armored convoys rolled down roads once used by traders and farmers. Congo's land, vast and rich, became a chessboard where African states played out rivalries that stretched back decades. The sheer scale of the conflict was staggering. By 1999, 9 nations had sent troops into Congo. Hundreds of militias, each with its own loyalties and grievances, fought beneath their banners. Villages could change hands multiple times in a single month, flying first the flag of the RCD, then Kabila's government, then Angola, then Uganda. For civilians, allegiance became a matter of survival. Who controlled the road that day? Who demanded food? Who pointed the gun? The war was no longer about Congo alone. It was about the survival of regimes, the crushing of old enemies, and the pursuit of diamonds, gold, and coltan, the minerals that fueled everything from jewelry to mobile phones. Like the great powers of 1914, the players in Congo spoke the language of principle. But beneath it all lay the relentless logic of self-interest. It was chaos on a continental scale, and yet, in the heart of that chaos, even more factions were waiting to emerge. As foreign armies dug themselves deeper into Congo's soil, the war fractured further. What began as a struggle between Kabila and the RCD soon multiplied into a kaleidoscope of rebel groups, each carving its own fiefdom out of Congo's vast, ungovernable terrain. The most prominent of these was the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, or MLC. Unlike the RCD, which leaned heavily on Rwandan influence, the MLC was nurtured by Uganda. Its leader, Jean-Pierre Bemba, presented himself as a nationalist alternative, claiming to be fighting not for Kigali, but for Congo. In reality, his movement was no less dependent on foreign backing. Uganda supplied weapons, training, and safe haven. The MLC grew into a formidable force, controlling swaths of northern Congo and even establishing a parallel administration in some towns. Meanwhile, the RCD itself began to splinter. Its leaders quarreled over ideology, strategy, and above all, foreign control. Some factions accused Rwanda of using them as pawns, while others leaned more heavily on Kigali's support to secure survival. The result was a patchwork of rebel factions, often fighting each other as fiercely as they fought Kabila's government. Congo's geography made this proliferation almost inevitable. It is a country the size of Western Europe, with dense jungles, vast savannas, and river systems that act as both lifelines and barriers. In such a landscape, warlords could establish mini-states with little fear of being dislodged. A diamond mine here, a logging concession there, each resource became the lifeblood of a militia, traded on the black market for weapons and fuel. And in the middle of it all were children. The war saw the rise of Kadogo, child soldiers pressed into service, often barely in their teens. Some were kidnapped from villages, others joined to survive, believing that carrying a rifle gave them a better chance than running unarmed through a battlefield. Their faces, too young to be hardened, became symbols of a war where innocence itself was a casualty. For civilians, the multiplication of rebel groups meant that the war was never distant. A village might be raided by one faction today, another tomorrow, and yet another the week after. Taxes were demanded at gunpoint, food was seized, women were taken as spoils, and each group, whether flying the banner of liberation or democracy, left behind the same trail of hunger and grief. By 1999, the Second Congo War had ceased to be a clash of governments alone. It had devolved into a struggle of countless actors, each carving out survival, power, or profit. Congo itself seemed to dissolve into fragments, its people trapped in a conflict with no single front line and no clear end. As if Congo's patchwork of militias and rebel factions were not already enough, the war soon attracted forces from even farther afield. Among them was a group whose name would one day become infamous around the world, the Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA. The LRA was not a Congolese creation at all. It was born in northern Uganda, where its leader, Joseph Kony, claimed to be a prophet chosen by God. In reality, Kony's movement was less a spiritual crusade than a cult of violence. His commandments were enforced through terror, mutilations, kidnappings, and massacres. Thousands of children were abducted, forced to carry weapons, and brainwashed into becoming killers for his cause. Girls were taken as wives for commanders, condemned to lives of abuse and servitude. To his followers, Kony was a messiah. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of nightmare. Backed by Sudan, eager to strike at Uganda by any means, the LRA found its way into Congo. The war provided the perfect cover: lawless jungles, porous borders, and a population too exhausted to resist yet another predator. In the northeast, villages already ravaged by the conflict now lived under the shadow of Kony's men, who raided without warning, leaving behind burned huts and shattered families. The LRA's presence underscored a grim truth. The Second Congo War was not a single war at all, but a magnet for Africa's unresolved conflicts. Uganda fought to suppress its insurgents. Rwanda battled the remnants of the Hutu genocidaires. Angola hunted UNITA. Sudan used militias to weaken its rivals. Each poured its own enemies into Congo's soil until the country became a graveyard of other nations' unfinished battles. For ordinary Congolese, the identities of these groups hardly mattered. Whether they were RCD rebels, MLC fighters, or LRA cultists, the results were the same. Villages plundered, families torn apart, children stolen. To live in eastern Congo during these years was to exist under perpetual siege, not knowing whose banner flew over the tree line or what new horror the night might bring. By the turn of the millennium, the Second Congo War had ceased to resemble a conventional conflict. It had become something far more frightening, a vortex of violence that drew in not only armies and governments, but cults and warlords, each feeding on Congo's vastness and the vulnerability of its people. As the stalemate deepened, the world's attention turned, fitfully and often half-heartedly, toward diplomacy. Leaders outside Congo sensed the danger of a conflict spiraling endlessly, a war so vast it threatened to destabilize the entire continent. And so, In 1999, the first attempts at peace were staged. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya inserted himself as a would-be mediator. With his trademark flair for spectacle, he summoned leaders to Tripoli, declaring himself the man to bring peace to Central Africa. But Gaddafi's diplomacy was as erratic as his politics. His talks were heavy on theater, light on follow-through. Delegates left his gilded halls with little more than photo opportunities, while the war on the ground continued without pause. More earnest efforts came from Nelson Mandela, then president of South Africa. Unlike Gaddafi, Mandela carried the moral weight of a man who had spent 27 years imprisoned for freedom. His presence at peace tables commanded respect. But even he could not bend Congo's fractured factions to his will. The problem was not a lack of leaders willing to talk. It was that there were simply too many factions to bring together. The Rally for Congolese Democracy, once a single rebel movement, had splintered into rival wings, each claiming legitimacy. Some leaned toward Rwanda, others toward Uganda, still others pursued local ambitions. To invite one group without the others was to risk delegitimizing the talks. To invite them all was to drown in cacophony. Mandela's mediation sessions, however well-intentioned, were hampered by this fracturing. The ink on one agreement was hardly dry before another faction rose to denounce it. On the ground, civilians listened to the news of peace accords with bitter skepticism. They had seen peace declared before, only to wake the next morning to the sound of gunfire. For the people of Ituri, Kivu, and Kisangani, international diplomacy was a distant theater, while their reality remained checkpoints, raids, and the ever-present fear of who might arrive tomorrow demanding loyalty. Still, the symbolism mattered. Mandela's presence signaled that Africa itself was trying to resolve Africa's war. Yet the results were fragile, fleeting, and incomplete. As one UN official admitted at the time, every peace conference ends with handshakes. And then, within days, the guns speak louder. The dream of reconciliation remained out of reach, buried beneath the weight of too many armies, too many agendas, and too much blood already spilled. By the year 2000, the Second Congo War took a new and unexpected turn. Two of the closest allies, Uganda and Rwanda, turned their guns not on Kabila, but on each other. What had begun as a partnership to topple a common enemy devolved into a bitter rivalry fought on Congolese soil. The city of Kisangani became the epicenter of this tragic feud. Once a bustling river port, a hub of trade and colonial architecture, Kisangani now found itself trapped between two foreign armies, both claiming the right to occupy it. At first, tensions were subtle. Rival checkpoints, disputes over diamond revenues, accusations of betrayal whispered between commanders. But soon the tension erupted into open battle. 3 times in 1999 and 2000, Kisangani became a battlefield. Ugandan and Rwandan troops, soldiers who had once marched together to overthrow Mobutu, now bombarded each other across the city's boulevards and neighborhoods. Mortar shells fell into residential districts. Bullets snapped through market stalls. Civilians cowered in basements, clutching their children as foreign soldiers fought their private war above. For the people of Kisangani, it was a cruel irony. They had endured raids from militias, the presence of child soldiers, the theft of food and resources. Yet now, the supposed protectors who had come to secure their region had become predators themselves. Reports estimated that nearly 1,000 civilians were killed in these clashes, though the true toll may have been far higher. The battles in Kisangani revealed the deeper truth of the Second Congo War. It was never just about Laurent Kabila or Congo itself. It was about power, influence, and resources. Uganda and Rwanda, once united in purpose, were now rivals for control of Eastern Congo's riches, diamonds, gold, timber, and the all-important mineral coltan, vital for electronics. The city became a symbol of their falling out, a graveyard for the myth of unity. International observers compared the spectacle to old European wars, when allies turned into enemies over spoils of conquest. But in Kisangani, the victims were not kings or generals. They were shopkeepers, teachers, children, and elders who paid the price of a conflict they never asked for. When the gunfire subsided, Kisangani stood scarred, buildings pockmarked, streets littered with debris, survivors burying their dead. Uganda and Rwanda, Once the twin engines of rebellion in Congo had become yet another pair of antagonists in a war already overflowing with them. In the heart of the Congo, allies had become enemies, and the circle of betrayal had tightened once more. As the war dragged on into the new millennium, the international community could no longer ignore the scale of Congo's suffering. By then, millions had been displaced, famine shadowed the countryside, and foreign armies were still entrenched. The United Nations responded with a familiar solution: peacekeepers. In late 1999, the UN authorized the deployment of MONUC, the United Nations mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Its mandate was cautious, its numbers modest, just 5,500 soldiers sent to monitor a country the size of Western Europe. The mismatch was almost absurd. Congo's vast jungles and shifting front lines could swallow entire armies. For civilians hoping the Blue Helmets would bring safety, their arrival often meant little more than the presence of another flag. The peacekeepers faced enormous challenges. They were not sent to fight, but to observe, to verify ceasefires that were fragile at best and non-existent at worst. They lacked the numbers to enforce security, often confined to bases while battles raged only miles away. In some regions, they became little more than spectators, watching helplessly as villages burned. Survivors would later recall the bitterness of seeing UN convoys roll past, unable or unwilling to intervene. Yet their presence was not entirely meaningless. In certain towns, the Blue Helmets offered at least a sliver of protection, a neutral zone where civilians might gather without fear of immediate attack. Their patrols, however limited, carried symbolic weight, a reminder that the outside world had not completely abandoned Congo. But for many Congolese, this was cold comfort. The scale of their suffering demanded more than symbols. The gulf between expectation and reality became a wound in itself. International headlines spoke of peacekeepers, yet on the ground, massacres continued. Rebels splintered further. Rwanda and Uganda still maneuvered their forces. Kabila's government clung to Kinshasa while losing ground elsewhere. The war's survivors understood something diplomats rarely admitted. Peace could not be imported by foreign troops alone. The Blue Helmets could monitor, they could bear witness, but they could not end the war. For Congo, peace would require something far riskier, political change within its own fractured heart. And that change, when it came, would arrive violently, with the sudden death of the man at the center of it all. On January 16, 2001, the man who had fought his way into Kinshasa just 4 years earlier met a sudden and violent end. Laurent-Désiré Kabila, president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, was shot inside his own palace by one of his bodyguards, a boy soldier barely in his teens. The details remain murky even today. Was it a personal act of desperation, a conspiracy by foreign powers, or betrayal from within his own circle? What is certain is that the bullet ended not only a man's life, but also an era of the war. The symbolism was haunting. Kabila, who had once promised to defend Congo's dignity against all foreign interference, was killed by one of the very child soldiers whose presence in his army had become a stain on his legacy. A revolutionary who had risen from the jungles, he died in the marble halls of power, undone by the very contradictions of his rule. In Kinshasa, confusion and fear followed. Ministers scrambled to control the narrative, even delaying the public announcement of his death to maintain a semblance of order. For ordinary Congolese, who had known only war and hardship under his rule, the news brought a strange mix of shock and resignation. A leader had fallen, but would life change? Few dared to hope. Into this vacuum stepped Joseph Kabila, Laurent's son. Quiet, reserved, and in his late 20s, Joseph was an unlikely successor, yet his youth became an asset. Unlike his father, he carried little of the baggage of betrayal or bombast. To foreign leaders, he seemed pragmatic, approachable, someone who could negotiate where his father had antagonized. Almost immediately, Joseph Kabila signaled a new direction. He spoke of dialogue, of peace, of the need to rebuild trust both inside and outside Congo. To war-weary Congolese, his calm demeanor contrasted with the fiery rhetoric of his father. To foreign powers, he offered an opening, a chance to step back from the abyss without losing face. But Joseph inherited more than a presidential title. He inherited a fractured nation, a devastated economy, and a war that had drawn in half of Africa. His task was monumental: to find peace without surrendering Congo's sovereignty, and to prove that his father's blood had not been spilled in vain. The assassination of Laurent Kabila did not end the Second Congo War, but it shifted its course. For the first time in years, there was a chance, however fragile, that diplomacy might succeed where armies had failed. With Joseph Kabila now at the helm, the war entered a new phase. Unlike his father, he was not a man of fiery speeches or grand posturing. Instead, his quiet pragmatism made him a bridge between warring factions. Within months of taking office, Joseph opened negotiations with Rwanda, Uganda, and the various rebel groups that still occupied large parts of Congo. The results came slowly, but they came. In 2002, the Sun City Agreement and later the Pretoria Accord laid the groundwork for peace. Rwanda and Uganda pledged to withdraw their troops. Rebel groups promised to disarm, at least on paper. A transitional government was envisioned, one that would eventually lead to elections. For the first time since 1998, there was real hope that Congo's nightmare might be ending. But peace in Congo was never simple. The accords were fragile, stitched together by compromise and international pressure. Many militias signed their names to agreements, only to rearm in secret. Foreign troops pulled back, but proxy groups remained. In places like Ituri and North Kivu, violence continued with chilling persistence. For villagers there, peace was something spoken of in distant conference halls, not something they lived. The war officially ended in 2003, when the transitional government was installed in Kinshasa. Yet the fighting never truly ceased. Skirmishes, massacres, and raids continued, especially in the east, where the lure of gold and coltan kept militias alive. Even today, decades later, the echoes of the Second Congo War still reverberate across the region. Millions remain displaced, communities shattered, and scars, both physical and psychological, run deep. Why, then, does the world not remember? Why is this conflict, Africa's World War, not spoken of in the same breath as Bosnia, Iraq, or Afghanistan? Part of the answer lies in the war's complexity. With so many nations, factions, and motives, it defied the simple narratives that capture headlines. Part of it lies in geography. Central Africa has long been ignored by Western media and history books. And part of it is uncomfortable truth. Congo's suffering did not fit neatly into the world's priorities. Yet to forget this war is to deny its victims the dignity of memory. Behind every statistic lies a human story: a farmer whose fields were burned, a child forced to fight, a mother searching for her lost family across the forests. Their voices may not have reached the global stage, but they remind us of what was endured. The Second Congo War was not merely a conflict between armies. It was the unraveling of a nation caught in the crossfire of history, colonial legacy, and human ambition. It was Africa's Great War, and its shadows remain.